Welcome to Chapter 12, The Musical Person. So, to what extent do genes predispose us to be musical human beings? And the two key terms here are the nature versus nurture. Many of you have heard this before. Nurture meaning our environment. How are we brought up? Who do we hang out with? Our social kind of aspect of looking at that. And then nurture is more of our biological. What really is biological in us being musical beings? So, data that is supportive of that musical is of inheritance, of is our biological makeup. There are numerous studies that have been done. Studies have found that if there's a high musical behavior of the parent, there's a greater likelihood that the children will be musical. Now, there's always, I hear all the time that, well, my child is musical, but I'm not. And to a certain extent, it's like, well, maybe you are, or were musical. You just never had the chance to um, have the activities or be exposed to the things that our children have these days. But again, most likely, if the parent is musical, more likely will the child. Again, when we're looking at standardized test scores, the higher the standardized test score, the more likely someone might have a musical attribute. Now, there's a lot of problems with that as well. As you know, there are some people who can take tests, and there's some people who are not. A lot of times, I find that maybe a student didn't do too well on the ACT or SAT score, but their musicianship skills are so high and very high, and a well-developed musician. Again, it's not always, but if you look at the overview, the general numbers of people, there is a strong correlation between students who have high standardized test scores and those of who have strong musical ability. They've also looked at twins, fraternal, and identical. Um, Again, twins usually exhibit, if one has musical ability, the other will as well. And again, the relationships between the anatomical brain structures and musical abilities. Again, this goes back to previous chapter where we talked about music and the brain, and we talked about musicians' brains are structured different than those of non-musicians. Now, when we talk of data in support of the acquisition of musical attributes, more from the nurturing side, relationships between home and social environments and musical attributes. Again, children who are exposed to musical um, experiences because of their social environment or are more likely to be musical than those are who are not exposed to it. And again, having a home where you promote musicianship, where you promote exploration of being musical beings, is the better chance of the child being a strong musician in the future. Again, that's not always the case, but versus a child who has piano lessons at a young age versus a child who doesn't by the time they're 18, let's say. Of course, there's going to be stronger attributes from the student or child who has had piano lessons for 12 years. Now, also in this, when students or children have had training in music, it also helps with them when, if you're testing between students who have had maybe private lessons versus those who have not. they're able to discriminate between pitches. Maybe something is high or low, or maybe they understand the musical phrasing better than students who have not. Again, this is just something that's more of a training than versus something that is more of a biological. A survey of music teachers in private studios believe that performance skills are improved with training. Well, that's the statement of the century. I mean, of course, the more that you are trained in something, the better you should be getting. Now, the musical personality is very interesting, and some of you, as I start going through the personality traits, may agree or disagree, but I want you to hear it all out. So, when we talk about personality, it basically gives that person their identity. A lot of times we refer to someone as introverted or someone as extroverted. Personality traits can change over time. I totally agree with this. As I was a undergrad, I was very extroverted. Even in master's school, my master's degree, I was very extroverted. Even when I was teaching public school, I was a very extroverted person. However, the older I get, the more introverted I become. The more, and I don't know if it's because I've been more secluded from maybe extracurricular activities as far as going out or performing less, or just I'm reading more. I don't know. I mean, it's just something for me to think about as a person, but has it changed for you over time? And if you're still, young, think about, are you becoming more extroverted or introverted as you get older? Numerous personalities have been identified in musicians. Now, this is where we start looking into different studies. Now, the one that your book talks about is probably one of the big foundational studies that have been done. Kemp, in 1982, stated that musicians share a common core of traits. One is they're introverted. Two, they're independent. Three, they have sensitivity. Four, there's anxiety involved in their traits. And the last one, psychological androgyny. Now, again, we'll talk about those on the next slide. So when Kemp stated that musicians are introverted, it basically meant that we're able to spend time alone in the practice room. A lot of professional musicians and even students who are becoming professional musicians, we spend a lot of time alone by ourselves in the practice room getting better. So this is what Kemp is stating when we're saying that musicians are introverted. We spend a lot of time by ourselves in a practice room. Independence. Musicians possess characteristics of originality. Especially if you are a jazz musician and you're able to improvise on the spot, or you're able to think of new and different ways of approaching maybe a piece of music that you didn't have that ability maybe a few years before. Again, these musicians, when we're talking about independence, they possess characteristics of originality. Now, here comes the next one, the third one, sensitivity, when we refer to imagination, outgoingness, and intuition. Most musicians are outgoing, and they have an extreme range of imagination. I'm not sure when we talk about outgoingness in this sense that after a concert, the more likely you would find the majority of the musicians at a bar drinking. It's very interesting to actually find that is true. A lot of the Fort Wayne Philharmonic friends I have in Fort Wayne, after a concert, they all go to the bar. Interesting. So anxiety, now there's two different kinds of anxiety when we talk about this. Trait anxiety is a long-term personality characteristic. Someone who has actually been diagnosed by a psychiatrist or that they're an anxious person. They have anxiety. Now, state anxiety is a lot different. This is when you're nervous in an immediate situation. Maybe state anxiety from a performance standpoint is you're performing a solo, or you have to wait 10 minutes in an orchestra playing a concert, and then your solo comes up. Even state anxiety goes to all types of situations. Maybe you're giving a speech for the first time, or you're giving a speech in front of a large crowd. That could make people nervous. And then last one, psychological androgyny. When you're comparing to the non-musician, male musicians are more sensitive, and female musicians are more aloof and self-sufficient. Now, again, I've seen many different musicians over my time, and I can tell this is maybe a little bit more true. But again, there's always the outliers of when we're talking about psychological androgyny. A study by Kemp in 1981 found that string players perceive themselves and to be perceived by others as unathletic, insecure, and introverted. Brass players are more athletic, self-confident, and extroverted image and self-image. Now, if you've ever met a trumpet player, I'll leave it at that for my musician students in the class. But I think brass players do exhibit a very confidence image, and they are, while I wouldn't say maybe they're more athletic, they are very they have a high self-image of themselves. They're very self-confident. And then when we talk about the remaining orchestra members, we're in the middle. Woodwind players were near the string players, where they perceive themselves and as perceived by others as unathletic, insecure, and introverted, while the percussionists near to the brass players, where brass players felt more athletic, self-confident, and had an extroverted image and self-image. Now, identities in music and music in identities. Again, these are two separate when you're talking about them. Identities in music are when a musician often gains identity in terms of a performance medium. Medium means through something, so maybe they're a bassoonist, maybe they're a singer. But they also identify themselves with a particular genre. Classical, jazz, popular. So maybe a musician who is identifies in music, or identities in music, they may be a classical bassoonist, a jazz saxophone, a popular singer, or a pop singer, I guess I should say would be more correct. Now, music in identity, which is the exact opposite, is concerned with how musicians use music in developing such aspects of identity as gender or nationality. For example, singing in an all-male chorus. Or I participate in the Drum Corps International, which is a big marching band organization. So think about these different ones. More is more specific, identities in music, but then music in identity is more global. I think such a wider range. We're talking about I sing in an all-female chorus, or I sing in the IPFW chorus, versus identities in music where we're talking about specifics. Preference for instruments. Abelus and Porter, 1978, did a study on gender association of instruments, which means what are considered feminine instruments. They asked numerous parents and about what instruments do they consider feminine. And these came out as to be clarinet, flute, or violin. Now, what are instruments that are considered to be masculine? These are considered to be trombone, percussion, trumpet, your brass and percussion players. Now, what's interesting is I actually, Hal Abeles was my instructor at Teachers College at Columbia University, and very, very informative professor, very smart, knew what he was talking about, and this was one of the founding research kind of in this area of musical preference for instruments in at this time. Most likely girls would go to the clarinet, flute, or violin. And boys would go to the trombone, percussion, or trumpet. Now, as a beginning band director, I tried my best to make sure that there were no association of instruments. As far as, I would show them, if I was introducing the clarinet, I would make sure I would show a male clarinetist or a male flute player. Same thing with the trombone and percussion. I would make sure I would show a female trombonist to make sure that there weren't any gender associations of our students with instruments. Now, again, it's society that creates these associations and stereotypes. I've also, Ableist redid this study in 2009, I believe, and I've posted it on Blackboard under This Week. It's an optional article for you to read. I'm not requiring it. But again, it's very interesting if you're talking about preference for instruments. Now, preference for musical genres. This is very interesting. Teach Out, Hodges, Mason, Wagoner found that more than 350 listeners were able to identify the correct musical genre with 76% accuracy from among 5 possibilities: classical, jazz, country, metal, and rap. And they were given 125 milliseconds all the way to 1,000 milliseconds. But think about this. Within 1,000 milliseconds or 125 milliseconds, you're able to already identify if a piece is going to be classical or jazz. Very interesting to me. Preferences to music are pretty stable at younger ages. Preferences do spread out when we get older. For instance, one might like jazz while another likes heavy metal. Again, when we get older, our musical preferences do spread out. There are some people that will not listen to heavy metal, but they will listen to classical and jazz all day long. When we talk about younger students, they do like all the different genres of music. Hargreaves, North, and Tarrant, when they discuss musical preference and taste into the context of 3 variables. So one is the listener, which is the gender or personality. The second one is music, the style, the familiarity, the complexity. And then the listening situation and context. Was it a formal concert? Was it leisure? Or was it at work? What's the social identity theory? So when we talk about that, we go into the example the book gives is a person might like popular music when they are out with their friends or at a bar. However, at home, they enjoy listening to classical music. And again, this is true. I can tell you that when I go out with my friends, I rather, of course I would like to hear more popular type music. But if I'm at home, if I'm cleaning, or if I'm driving in the car by myself, I'm more likely to listen to classical music. Although the older I get, the more I listen to NPR, more of the talk radio type. But again, I still enjoy my classical music while listening in the car by myself. Usually when I'm with friends, we listen to more of what's happening currently, pop music. But again, people choose specific music for specific situations. So again, while this tutorial video is very short. There's still numerous ways of looking at this chapter. Some of you have picked the musical person, talking about preference for your study. And the book gives numerous resources for you to choose from. When you're talking about what is the preference of adolescents, what is the preference of musicians versus non-musicians. Again, there's numerous studies out there that identify this. All right, that is the end of chapter 12.